Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, August 23rd, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside will reach a high of 90.5 degrees Fahrenheit today, with a low of 75.0 degrees. It's shaping up to be a warm August day, so remember to stay hydrated, seek out air conditioning, and take breaks in the shade if you're spending time outdoors. On today's program, we'll delve into the significant reasons behind why the U.S. government acquired a stake in Intel and what that could mean for the tech industry and beyond. Plus, we'll be examining the unprecedented pressure currently facing the Federal Reserve and why its decisions are under such intense scrutiny. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a groundbreaking development that could reshape the relationship between corporate America and the White House. Yesterday, President Donald Trump announced a historic deal involving tech giant Intel Corporation. Here to chip in on the details is our tech reporter, Ethan.
Grace, this is certainly a powerful pixel in the picture of American industrial policy. President Trump announced yesterday, August 22nd, that Intel Corporation would grant the U.S. government a 10% stake in the company. He called it a, quote, historic agreement, end quote, and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick confirmed this, as ABC News has uncovered. It truly is a significant and unusual intervention.
Unusual indeed, Ethan. A 10% stake is quite a bite. What are the specifics of this agreement? How much is the government investing? And where is that money coming from?
Well, Grace, while President Trump initially valued the deal at $10 billion, Intel later clarified the exact figures. The government will make an $8.9 billion investment in Intel common stock, purchasing 433.3 million shares at $20.47 per share. This price, according to reporting, was a discount from Intel's closing price of $24.80 on Friday, August 22nd, creating an immediate on-paper gain of $1.9 billion for the government.
That's quite a return on investment right out of the gate. But $8.9 billion is no small sum. Is this new money, or are we reallocating existing funds?
It's largely a reallocation, Grace. The funding isn't a new cash infusion, but a conversion of existing government commitments. $5.7 billion comes from grants previously awarded under the CHIPS and Science Act, but not yet paid. For our viewers, the CHIPS and Science Act is a 2022 law designed to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing, essentially bringing chip production back home to the U.S. An additional $3.2 billion will come from the Defense Department's Secure Enclave program, which supports U.S. semiconductor manufacturing.
So this is less about fresh capital and more about leveraging existing strategic investments. What about the government's role as a shareholder? Will they have a seat at the table or influence on Intel's operations?
Not directly, Grace. The terms of the deal stipulate that the U.S. government's ownership will be passive and non-voting, with no board representation or other governance or information rights. According to the agreement, the government has also agreed to vote with Intel's board of directors on shareholder matters, quote, with limited exceptions, end quote. There is also a 5-year warrant for an additional 5% of Intel common shares, exercisable only if Intel ceases to own at least 51% of its foundry business, serving as a strategic safeguard.
That's a unique arrangement. It sounds like the government wants a piece of the pie but not necessarily to bake it. But why now? Intel has been described as a, quote, struggling chip maker, end quote, and President Trump was quite critical of CEO Lip-Bu Tan earlier this month. What's the context here?
It's a fascinating turnaround, Grace. According to reporting, Intel has indeed faced challenges, falling behind rivals like NVIDIA in the race for AI-enabling GPUs. The company saw declining revenue and net losses in the first 2 quarters of 2025 and has jettisoned over 20,000 workers since late 2023. President Trump had initially demanded CEO Lip-Bu Tan's resignation over, quote, problematic ties to China, end quote. However, after a White House meeting, Trump reversed his stance, hailing Tan as, quote, highly respected, end quote, after Tan, quote, professed his allegiance to the U.S., end quote. This deal underscores the administration's aggressive efforts to accelerate domestic chip manufacturing particularly in response to China's technological advancements.
So it's about national security and technological leadership, with a side of corporate diplomacy. How does this equity stake fit into the broader industrial policy? And how does it differ from a standard government subsidy?
This is indicative of a broader, highly interventionist industrial policy, GRACE, aimed at bolstering the U.S. semiconductor industry. It signals a, quote, national champion, end quote, approach. Unlike a direct subsidy, which is typically a payment without an ownership stake, this is an investment in common stock. This makes the government a shareholder, carrying the potential for financial returns if Intel's stock performs well. Even without direct voting power, the government, as one of Intel's largest shareholders, can exert, quote, soft power, end quote, influencing decisions to align with national security and economic priorities, especially with those, quote, limited exceptions, end quote, in voting.
That makes sense. It's a different kind of leverage. But many might wonder how this affects Intel's existing obligations, especially those tied to the CHIPS Act grants. Does this new deal alter those conditions?
It significantly alters them, Grace. According to reporting, a critical change is the elimination of existing clawback and profit-sharing provisions associated with the $2.2 billion in CHIPS grants Intel had already received. This suggests the $5.7 billion converted from unpaid CHIPS grants will also not be subject to those prior, more stringent conditions. While it potentially frees Intel from stricter, project-specific grant requirements, critics are questioning whether a passive equity stake without the stringent performance mandates of traditional grants will sufficiently guarantee Intel's foundry business flourishes.
That certainly raises some eyebrows. This sounds like an unprecedented level of government intervention. What are the legal implications? And is Congress on board with this dramatic departure from precedent?
Grace, this move is indeed being described as, quote, an unprecedented level of government intervention, end quote, and a, quote, dramatic departure from precedent, end quote. According to reporting, the legal authorization for this conversion is being questioned, with the transaction raising, quote, legal issues including statutory authority to reprogram grants under the CHIPS and Science Act, end quote. There's been, quote, immediate condemnation, end quote, from members of Congress, such as Senator Ron Wyden, who labeled it, quote, corporate extortion, end quote. Concerns about administrative, congressional oversight, and potential constitutional or antitrust scrutiny are certainly being raised.
Given the controversy, are there any historical precedents for the U.S. government taking equity stakes in major companies like this?
While rare for the U.S. government, there are precedents, Grace. During the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. government took a majority stake in General Motors. More recently, the Department of Defense used a Cold War-era law for a deal with MP Materials, a rare earth metals company. So while this Intel deal is unique in its scale and context, it's not entirely without historical echoes.
Ethan, that was an incredibly incisive look at a truly monumental deal. Thank you for making these complex details so crystal clear. We appreciate your reporting.
My pleasure, Grace.
That was story 1 of 2 this morning. When we come back, we'll turn our attention to... Welcome back, everyone. For our second story this morning, we're diving into the economic waters, where Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is navigating some incredibly complex and politicized currents. We're talking about the central bank's independence being challenged amidst signals of potential interest rate cuts. For more on this, let's go to our economics reporter, Chloe.
Thanks, Grace. Indeed, Chairman Powell is truly in a difficult spot, trying to balance economic realities with intense political pressure.
So let's start with the economic front. What's the latest on interest rates? And what is Powell signaling?
Well, according to reporting from the Seattle Times and Times U.S. News and World Report, Powell has indicated the Fed could initiate interest rate cuts soon, possibly as early as its next meeting in September. That's less than a month away.
A rate cut? That would be a significant shift, wouldn't it? What are the odds, and why now?
It certainly would be, Grace. Futures markets are indicating a high probability, between 89 and 91% of a 25 basis point cut in September, as noted by TimesInvestopedia.com and TimesMcIlvaney.com. For our viewers, a basis point is simply 1/100th of a percentage point, so 25 basis points is 1/4%. Powell's rationale, expressed during a speech in Grand Teton National Park, is rooted in concerns about a weakening economy. He pointed out that economic growth notably slowed to an annual rate of 1.2% in the first half of 2025, a significant drop from 2.5% last year. He also cited a marked slowing in demand for workers, which could lead to higher unemployment.
Those are certainly worrying economic indicators. What's the current short-term interest rate, and what does this mean for future cuts?
The Fed's current key short-term interest rate stands at 4.3%, according to the Seattle Times. While an easing cycle might be beginning, Powell has also suggested that the neutral level for rates might be higher than in the 2010s, implying future cuts may not bring rates back to pre-pandemic lows. It seems we won't be returning to the good old days of near-zero rates anytime soon.
Now, let's talk about the political headwinds you mentioned, specifically from President Donald Trump. He's been quite vocal about the Fed, hasn't he?
Vocal is an understatement, Grace. In stark contrast to Powell's data-driven approach, President Trump has aggressively pressured the Fed to, quote, slash rates, end quote, arguing there is, quote, no inflation, end quote. He's called for rates as low as 1% or even, quote, 0 or less, end quote, a level no Fed official supports. This pressure campaign has been described as an, quote, extraordinary attack, end quote, on the Fed's autonomy by TimesCron.com, and, quote, unprecedented, end quote, by Times The Washington Post and *AtlanticCouncil.org.
And it seems the president isn't just pressuring on policy, but also targeting specific Fed officials. Can you tell us about the situation with Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook?
That's right, Grace. Most notably, President Trump has demanded Governor Lisa Cook's resignation and threatened to fire her if she doesn't step down. These threats are based on serious mortgage fraud allegations made by Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Bill Polt, a Trump appointee and ally, as reported by TimesFoxBusiness.com.
What are these allegations against Governor Cook? It sounds like some real trouble is cooking for her.
They are quite detailed, Grace. Polte publicly raised the claims on X, formerly Twitter, and sent a criminal referral to the Department of Justice on August 15th. That was just 8 days ago, as TimesAlJazeera.com and *CBSNews.com uncovered. He alleges that Cook, in June 2021, took out a 15-year mortgage on an Ann Arbor, Michigan property, agreeing to use it as her primary residence. Then, just 2 weeks later, she secured a 30-year mortgage for an Atlanta condominium, also reportedly agreeing to designate it as her primary residence. Mortgage rates for primary residences are typically lower than those for secondary or investment properties, leading to the accusation that Cook, quote, falsified bank documents and property records to acquire more favorable loan terms, end quote, according to *WashingtonTimes.com. Polte further claimed Cook listed the Georgia property for rent in September 2022, but her financial disclosures did not report rental income, as *MPAMag.com noted.
That's a serious set of accusations. What's been the Department of Justice's response, and how has Governor Cook reacted?
The Department of Justice has confirmed it is actively investigating these allegations, as reported by TimesWashingtonPost.com. Ed Martin, a top DOJ official, has even urged Fed Chair Powell to remove Cook from the board immediately. However, Governor Cook, appointed by former President Joe Biden, has firmly denied any wrongdoing, stating she learned of the allegations through media reports and has, quote, no intention of being bullied to step down from my position because of some questions raised in a tweet, unquote, according to Times U.S. News and World Report. Her term extends until 2038.
So can a president simply fire a Fed governor?
Not easily, Grace. Legally, a Fed governor can only be removed, quote, for cause, end quote, a provision generally interpreted as requiring evidence of serious misconduct, not just policy disagreements. This protection, stemming from the 1935 Supreme Court case Humphreys Executor versus United States, ensures the Fed's independence, as explained by timesbrookings.edu knows and timesjustia.com. No U.S. president has ever successfully removed a sitting Federal Reserve governor against their will. So the Fed has a history of sticking to its guns, so to speak.
Beyond Governor Cook, are there other ways the administration is trying to influence the Fed?
Absolutely. President Trump has also nominated top White House economist Stephen Miran to replace former Governor Adriana Kugler, who resigned 15 days ago on August 8th. Miran is known for advocating lower interest rates. If confirmed, he would likely add another, quote, pro-rate cut and, quote, vote to the FOMC, potentially shifting the dynamics, according to *AtlanticCouncil.org.
This all boils down to the question of Federal Reserve independence. Why is that so crucial for the economy?
A politically independent central bank is widely viewed as crucial for preventing inflation, allowing it to make difficult decisions without political interference, as the Seattle Times reports. The Federal Reserve even issued a rare, strongly worded statement in May 2025, affirming its independent, nonpartisan role. Powell has consistently stressed the Fed's decisions are made, quote, solely on careful, objective, and non-political analysis, end quote. Beth Hammack, president of the Cleveland Fed, emphasized her commitment to independence, trying to, quote, tune out all the other noise, end quote, as she put it. Disturbingly, the Fed's independence index has reportedly declined significantly from 87 in 2023 to 62 in 2025, reflecting growing political interference, according to *Ainvest.com.
That decline in independence is certainly concerning. But let's bring it back to the economy. Chloe, you mentioned both weakening growth and persistent inflation. How does the Fed navigate this economic dilemma?
It's a real tightrope act, Grace. Despite the slowdown, persistent inflation remains a concern. Powell acknowledged that tariffs have begun to lift goods prices, creating a, quote, one-time shift in the price level, end quote, that Fed officials will monitor closely, making them cautious about aggressive rate cuts, according to timescron.com. The dilemma is clear rate cuts could support a softening labor market, but they could also exacerbate inflation. Michael Strain of the American Enterprise Institute even warns that if inflation worsens while hiring continues, the Fed might be forced to reverse course and raise rates again, potentially damaging its credibility.
We've seen presidents try to influence the Fed before. Is this truly unprecedented?
Well, presidents have certainly tried to exert pressure historically, from Woodrow Wilson during World War I to Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly shoving Fed Chair William McChesney Martin Jr. in 1965, and Richard Nixon pressuring Arthur Burns for lower rates before the 1972 election. The current pressure from Donald Trump on Jerome Powell and Lisa Cook is widely regarded as an, quote, unprecedented, end quote, level of direct presidential intervention in modern times, as *AtlanticCouncil.org notes. Powell, whose term as chair is less than 9 months away, ending in May 2026, is truly facing a historic challenge to maintain the Fed's crucial independence.
Chloe, thank you for breaking down this incredibly complex situation for us. A lot to keep an eye on there.
My pleasure, Grace.
We'll be right back after this short break. Here are some other headlines. In a grim milestone, a famine has been formally declared in Gaza City and its surrounding areas. The announcement comes from the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, a UN-backed body, which states that over 500,000 people are facing catastrophic starvation and destitution. The report finds that at least 1 in 5 households has an extreme lack of food, and the death rate from starvation has reached at least 2 people per 10,000 per day. UN officials are calling the crisis entirely man-made and a moral outrage, attributing it to restrictions on humanitarian aid. The UN's top human rights official stated that using starvation as a method of warfare is a war crime. Israel has vehemently rejected the declaration, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling it an outright lie and a modern blood libel, insisting over 100,000 aid trucks have entered the territory. The conflicting narratives have put the technical process of declaring a famine under a global microscope. In Hawaii, a legal battle is brewing over the abortion pill. A federal judge in Honolulu is weighing the legality of FDA restrictions on mifepristone. The ACLU, representing a Kauai-based doctor, argues that remaining rules, like special certification for prescribers and pharmacies, are not scientifically justified and create unnecessary barriers to care, especially in rural areas. The case originated with a doctor whose patients were forced to take a 300-mile round-trip flight for abortion services. The Department of Justice, defending the FDA, contends that the pill safety is dependent on the very restrictions being challenged. The judge has not yet indicated when she will issue a ruling, but the outcome could deliver significant changes to medication abortion access nationwide. Tensions are firing up on the Korean peninsula after South Korean troops fired warning shots at North Korean soldiers who briefly crossed the border on Tuesday. Pyongyang is calling the incident a, quote, serious provocation, claiming its soldiers were simply conducting construction work to, quote, completely separate the two countries. The North alleges the South fired more than 10 machine gun rounds in a, quote, premeditated act. This all happened as the U.S. and South Korea conduct their annual joint military exercises, which the North regularly condemns. South Korea confirmed the warning shots, stating the northern soldiers retreated without returning fire. While similar accidental crossings have been common recently as North Korea fortifies the border, this war of words marks a significant escalation. And if you saw the headline, assertive presidential power, here's the story behind it. The phrase comes from an NPR interview with Ankush Kardori, a former federal prosecutor, who discussed the remaining legal checks on the Trump administration. Kardori is examining what he describes as the Justice Department's failure to hold the former president accountable, which he argues has major implications for the rule of law. The conversation centers on legal theories like broad presidential immunity and the various options, from congressional oversight to criminal prosecution, that could be used to counter what some see as an overreach of executive power. Finally, in Bolivia, the scales of justice could be tipping dramatically. The nation's Supreme Court has issued a rare and urgent order to review the pre-trial detentions of 3 high-profile right-wing politicians, including former interim President Jeanine Áñez. The review, which must be completed within 24 hours, could pave the way for their release. The politicians were arrested on charges of terrorism and sedition following the 2019 political crisis that saw President Evo Morales ousted from power. The surprise court order comes just days after an election that ended 2 decades of dominance by the ruling leftist party, leading some critics to suggest the court is trying to sympathize with the changing political times. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Sonnet 4.0, Gemini Pro 2.5, Gemini Flash 2.5, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.